Thank you everybody for coming. Our next presenter is Guillaume Mauge. All right. Guillaume is a research scientist at the UW Climate Impacts Group, specializing in climate science. His work focuses on understanding and adapting the impacts of climate change in the Pacific Northwest, with a particular focus on water. So please welcome Guillaume.
Thanks, and I see there's gonna be a plant sale over here. All right, so we have a lot of time, and I want to assure you ahead of time. I did not plan, and I will not talk the whole time. I want to have lots of back and forth here. I think I've got about 40 minutes worth of slides. Oh, yeah, thanks. And then the other thing I wanted to say is I gave almost exactly the same presentation at the Respiration Northwest conference, so I apologize if this is round 2 for you. Hopefully it'll still be helpful. The real point here is I feel like so I'm, at the UW, I do over the climate impact group, we work on climate adaptation to try to help people prepare for climate change. I think one of the things that we generally do a really good job of is making it more complicated than it should be. And so my goal here was to kind of break down and sort of share some lessons that I've learned and also try to make it simpler, right? I mean, I think you all do really important work in the river restoration world, but also in conservation world writ large. And it would be a shame by thinking about climate change that maybe did less of that, right? And we don't want that, right? So that's kind of the goal here. All right. So I want to talk about. So I'm going to get into the sort of lessons learned, but I want to just start with the science. I'm focusing on climate change impacts on rivers, including estuaries, as you can see here. But feel free to ask about others. There's obviously climate change impact, that affect your work that may be outside of the river space. But here's my quick introduction, and in each case I'm going to try to talk about what we've seen so far as well as what we expect in the future. So here's the first example of sea level rise. This is, if anybody is familiar with Alki Beach in Alki or Alki, I never know, but in Seattle. This is that's a stairwell that's underwater there, and it's obviously not a picture taken from the future. It's taken during a 2-foot surge event. But 2 feet turns to be about what you'd expect in terms of field rise. So this is kind of like looking at the future high tide. It would be the average high tide, around 2100. So stairs are underwater, and obviously the stairs are under the beaches too, right? So not the most critical infrastructure, right? But you could imagine if there was a culvert that was, below that level, it's not draining anymore, back into the storm drains or other effects to the root zone and things like that. It's all groundwater. We have seen sea level rise so far. You all know that. I know the Seattle tide gauge actually shows a bigger number than these 4 inches I'm listing here. I'm listing the numbers for Friday Harbor because we live in a tectonically active region. There's not a Friday Harbor. There's not a lot of effect of those tectonics on the land motion. So it's kind of a neutral place to look at like what just the sea level rise be. In Seattle, it's more like 9 inches, and that's because the land levels drop at the same time as the sea level. In the future, we're going to have enough sea level rise, but that tectonic piece is that important. But good to know for now. Snow's the other big one. I think everybody knows about this, especially those of you who are in the Northwest for the year 2015. When it was really warm, we had a really bad snow year. It's kind of the canary in the coal mine for climate change and the hydrology of our region, because I mean, the way that I like to say it is because mountains are pointy on top, right? So like the snow line is going to go up, right? It's freezing level is going to go up, and that's a lot of real estate that you're losing initially, right? And so we've even up to now already seen big changes. So there's a study that was a big study looking across the West a couple of years ago that found that on average it's about a 15 to 30% decline since about 1950. This is kind of the middle estimate, 25% loss for the Cascades. That's huge, right? It's it's already, we've seen that, and then that's not accounting for what we're going to see in the future, right? It's going to be even worse in the future, right? So that's why I take canary in the coal mine. We're talking about really massive changes in a lot of places. For those of you who come from the east side, The Cascades, you know, a lot of your rivers are heavily influenced by snowpack, westside too, but especially, you know, either the Methow River or the Yakima. Those are going to go from having those peaking floods and during the spring freshet to having peak floods in winter, right? Because you're just going to have that much less snowpack, you're going to have that much more rain. So just to illustrate the scale of that change, there's a set of really ugly maps I'm sharing with you. But this is a way that we classify, talking about the Yakima and the Methow rivers, because they are what we call snow dominant under certain perspectives. So the snow is sort of dominating the runoff hydrology. That's the blue in that in this watershed picture, and the red is a mix of rain and snow, and the green is it's warm enough that there's not really any snow to speak of. So that's the current picture. Here's the picture mid-century, and here's the picture by the end of the century.
Wow.
So British Columbia is doing okay, but the rest of the region really is losing its snowpack, right? So it's changing to a totally different regime. You know, for this topic here today, I think this is really the big effect to be aware of, right? It's going to be a lot more peaking, a lot flashier rivers, right? A lot more peaking in winter, a lot less snowpack and earlier snowmelt peak, and a smaller one. Right, so that's the second big impact, otherwise snowpack. And the third one that I want to mention is heavy rain events. So those are projected. This is pretty recent. I mean, recent and relative term, but in the last decade or so, the research has really become clear on this, showing that heavy rain events will become more intense. You'll notice I didn't show the past trend on this, and that's because there isn't one. If you look at the observations, they're kind of all over the map. The year-to-year changes in those heavy rain events is more important up to now. And even through the next few decades, it's really at the end of the century that you really start to see these becoming important. So if you're designing something for between now and 2050, you probably don't need to think about this too much. But for beyond there, you do. And then the last one I mentioned, wildfire, right? I ain't talking about rivers, but as you all know, that's really important, right? Post-fire flooding and that sort of thing is a really big deal. This is a picture on the east side. But it is an effect on the west side, which is smaller and not pronounced, and also not clear in the science. On the east side, it's very clear. The science is very clear, you know, warmer conditions, and combined with, as you all know, a history of fire suppression, right? So we've got a lot of bird buildup of risk, right? And that's going to have major impact on flooding and water quality downstream. Okay, so those are the impacts we're dealing with. I wanted to also just spend one moment to just kind of walk through, again, probably familiar to all of you all, just the different ways that we expect climate change to affect salmon in particular. So this is just your standard sort of salmon life cycle plot. And I just want to walk through the different ways that we can see impact. So I mentioned more floods, especially in the winter, you know, because of a lot of that snowmelt peak. So that can be, you know, bad for the reds and for the really early life stages. The other one that I mentioned, so I may not have been as clear about this, but you know, earlier snowmelt peak, so earlier spring freshet and a smaller spring freshet can affect those juveniles and the smolt. And then because you've got earlier snowmelt, you've got less water coming into the streams in summer, so you're going to have warmer streams, and that one's a double whammy actually, because you've got warmer air temperatures too. So you're going to get even more warming in those streams because there's less water and warmer air. And then, of course, I think a lot of you know the ocean survival rate is really low. What goes on in the ocean is really important for these populations. Unfortunately, or somewhat ironically, that's where we know the least about what the impacts are. These other impacts, I think, were pretty well quantified, and we can look at in detail. It's a lot harder to know what's going on in terms of the ocean. So that's a really important unknown just to be aware of. But the big picture here is climate change has impact all across the same life cycle, right? So the major concern, you know, as you all know, even without climate change, the situation isn't great, right? So then it's going to be hard to undershoot in terms of restoration, right? Overshoot, excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two more technical things, and then I'll stop and we'll move on to lessons learned. But I wanted to not just tell you about all the sort of bad news, but also talk about some of the resources that are available. So I wanted to just highlight two examples, and they're examples of larger categories. So first, there's lots of guidance out there. I think there's always probably more guidance than any of us want to read, but you know, there is good guidance on how to use and find and apply climate change information. And this isn't very readable on this slide here, but it's one example that is generally pretty readable. It's written in like kind of bullet form, flow chart, so you don't have to go through it from start to finish to get anything out of it. There's also a lot of data resources out there. These are just 3 examples. And by the way, if you can't get any of this down right away, feel free to get in touch with me. I don't know if the slides are going to be posted. They will. Okay, so you'll be able to look at these later. These are just some examples. My main recommendation about these kinds of things is don't try to be comprehensive, right? There's way more than you're ever going to want to know about out there. I would, few to the ones that work for you or that other people are using. There's probably overlap between a lot of them. So I wouldn't, you can just hit the rabbit hole, right? So just stick to the ones that are helpful. Okay, that's it on the sort of science technical piece. I just want to check this chat. Thanks for posting that. Yeah. Okay, let's stop there. Are there any questions before I move on? Okay. All right. So, did you want to?
Oh, no, sorry.
All right. So the rest of my talk is really kind of like, so I've been doing this work for 10 or 15 years now. And this is my attempt to distill what I've learned so far that I think is useful in your context. And this is probably the part where there's probably going to be the most benefit to sort of hearing, if you think I'm off base for one thing, or if there's something we can clarify, or just talking about the details. All right, so there we go. Okay, so I've sort of framed these as a bunch of sort of statements and examples. So here's my first statement. So I think often the tendency is to dive straight into the data or the technical details, but actually I think it's better to take a step back and ask, what do you need to know? And in this case, I think the biggest big question is like, how adaptive or adaptable is what you're doing, right? Because there's always uncertainty about predicting the future, right? And there's always, and you all know with your projects, like what happens if the project doesn't work out as planned, or what happens if conditions change and you need to adapt them. What are your options for doing that, right? And if things are very adaptable, or if it's kind of low risk, it goes, well, it might not be that important to consider climate change, because you can always come back later and adjust. If on the other hand, say you're putting in a dam, and if that dam bursts, it's like obviously really dangerous, right? You might want to be a lot more careful, right? And be a lot more conservative in the way you design it. And so this is just no need to take the details out here, but it's just illustrating uncertainty in climate protection, what I just said, right? We're predicting the future, it goes far to the range of uncertainty in one particular set of examples. This is really just an illustration that we have that uncertainty, right? We're trying to predict things like how much population will grow over the century, because that affects greenhouse gas emissions, right? And then what is how does the climate respond to greenhouse gas emissions? All right, second point is there's lots of different ways to do this. So there's no need to get locked into one way. If it's not working, if it's too complicated, step back and think about how to do it. So one example so typically, I think my experience is the way that we often jump in first is, grab some climate change information. If you have a model, plug it into the model, or you have a design standard, plug in the design standard and see what happens, right? But that's one way. There's other ways to do it, and this is just one example. So another example is to actually sort of, instead of that kind of top-down approach, plugging in data and seeing what happens, take a bottom-up approach and looking at what you're doing and seeing, how sensitive it would be to changes. So this is an example from Portland. It's probably more numbers than you want on one side, but this basically Portland asked that question. They were starting to look at their stormwater system. They wanted to look at climate change impacts. They had, like a lot of these big jurisdictions, had models for how the stormwater system works. But they looked at the climate models and the different options, and they just sort of decided, okay, we're going to come back to that. It's complicated. We're not ready for it. But we do have this model. We understand how it works. So instead of diving in on the climate projections, let's just take our model and kind of poke at it and see what happens. So the way that they looked at it, and they're looking at stormwater, they looked at changes in the intensity of precipitation, changes in the volume of precipitation for their design events, the design storms, and they just asked, what does that mean for our impacts? And it turns out in that case, that was more or less what they needed, because there's the same hotspots kept showing up. That's that map on the left. And so they actually didn't, you don't need to touch climate projections at all in this case, right? You don't need to talk to anybody like me, right? You can just kind of poke at it, see what happens. And then maybe that's enough in some cases, right? So it's just another way of looking at it. So the point here is just take a step back. There's more than one way to do it. You know, starting simpler is probably better. Okay, another point is that what the consequences of climate change or the vulnerability, our vulnerability to climate change is more than just about what are the changes that we're going to see. And so the way that I like to talk about that is that there's three factors. So this is kind of classic risk management, if you all are familiar with that. But the three factors are how much change is going to happen. That would be the impact, right? But another one is like how much would it have to change to matter? Right, so it's one thing for temperatures to go up by 1 degree C. It's another thing for that to make a difference, right? And I mean, not in a lot of cases, right? Like in planting, for instance, may not be the biggest thing. And then the third one is what's the adaptive capacity, right? So I think you all are familiar with adaptive management, same question. These are the technical terms: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. These are pretty standard risk management. But the point is, I think we often tend to focus on the exposure, right? Like how much climate change is happening. But these other pieces are sometimes more important, right? In that Portland example, they were looking at the second one, the sensitivity. And then in an adaptive management context, you might be looking more at the third. And that's going to tell you how much the other two ones. All right, another point is that we're not just talking about climate change, right? Like, and we don't want to just consider climate change. I think I'm stating the obvious for this group, right? But there's a lot of things you have to manage for, right? And climate change could be just one, should be just one of them, right? And may not, in many cases, be the most important one. For me, the way that I think about this is just, I think about all the other ways that the landscape has changed since European settlement. So, you know, for example, this is that everybody likes to beat up on the core. So this is what I'm doing here. This is a picture. This is a picture of burning log jams from not that long ago on the South Fork Mipsack River from, I think, the 1970s. And that was a common thing to do, clear log jams, right? A lot. You all probably know about the history of logging along riparian corridors. So this is one example. Another one, some of you might know about the Osborne panoramas that was one of the New Deal project. Yeah, they're really cool. And this is an example from near here, near Wenatchee.
Guillaume, could you just click off the bar on top because it's covered?
Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.
Yeah, so they've actually gone back in a project and retaken these same panoramas, so you can look at them back and forth. So here's 1934 for this one scene, and here's 2010. And this is totally a common, this is not a unique, I'm not cherry picking here, the difference in the landscape, right? You see all those open areas, spaces, you see how it's sort of reforested and you know, probably they're primarily a consequence of fire suppression, right? We used to have lots of small fires, if you had patchier forests, you had less risk of large fires. Now we have pretty dense, pretty uniform forests everywhere, right? And this has, I bring this up because, you know, one, it's just an illustration of how different the landscape is. And in some cases, we've forgotten how much it's changed. Maybe not this group. But also because this is huge implications for the hydrology, right? There's all this research that the young trees take up a lot of water, right? And there's real consequences for low flows right during the spawning period. So I think there's really big changes that are really important. That's not a climate change effect, right? And you all are managing for those kinds of changes as well. And in some cases, I would say probably in a lot of cases, those changes, if you even reverse a portion of them, you'd probably be doing more than enough to accommodate the climate change effects, right? And there's like a lot of room for you know, addressing the climate change through the existing work that you all do. I think I'm stating the obvious for this group again, but you know, maybe this is more for folks like me who work, you know, kind of more on the data geek side of things. like the data isn't gonna solve your problems for you, right? It's often that there are other things that are sort of making it challenging to get enough restoration and enough work done, right? And so that's the obvious thing I'm stating here. And the example that I think might raise the blood pressure in the room that I had from a year ago was like, when we knew that the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act would come through with a lot of money, I feel like the big thing that everybody was worried about was not like, how am I going to quantify the climate change impact so I can design my project correctly, right? It was like, how am I going to have the project management capacity to take advantage of that funding and not miss the bus, right? So, I mean, I think that's far more important, right? I mean, than anything that I could provide in terms of data. So I think it's good to sort of keep that perspective. Another example along those lines is the social sciences have been underrepresented in this work, right? And there's a lot that is really important in terms of how people's values relate to what solutions are most effective, right? Or, how the institutions that we have may actually not be, maybe a barrier to action in some instances, right? Or maybe in conflict in terms of their objective. So a classic example there is the biological opinions, right, that NOAA releases about how Army Corps and FEMA policies are actually in violation of the Endangered Species Act, right? So we have these really big issues that are not related to climate change that are in some cases more important. Another one is, again, so there's a theme, one of the themes through everything I'm saying is that there's all this science on like the future impacts of climate change, and there's different ways. You don't have to go that way to understand it. Another way is that we can learn from events as they happen, right? So we don't always have to look forward in models. We can take advantage of those events to really see as a window into what the impacts are going to be in the future. So one example is 2015. I brought it up earlier, right? Those of you that weren't here for the year 2015. Was anybody not here for the year 2015 in Washington State? All right, good. Okay, good. Worth repeating. So yeah, that was from a weather heat perspective, that was kind of insane. So it's like, you hear about weather records in the news, but they're like daily temperature records or like monthly average, like May was the record month this year. But annual records like never happen, and this was like not just an annual record, but it was like way outside of anything anybody thought was possible. It's like 5 degrees warmer on average for the whole year. Insane. And it turns out 5 degrees warmer on average for the whole year is about what you'd expect the new normal to be in 2070, 2080. So this is kind of like a window into what the 2070s or 2080s would look on a year in, year out basis, right? And so we saw, the hard part with the models is models can say what the temperature change is, with some work can say what the stream flow change is, snowpack, right? It's a lot harder to say, well, that means that 250,000 sockeye are going to die, right? Or like the blackberry crop is not going to be viable that year, right? It's like those are trickier. And so when the events happen, you can actually just see them unfold, right, and learn from them and learn what works and what doesn't. So we learned about the impacts, right? I mentioned the sockeye die-off. We saw wildfires. We also learned from the management side. So in ag, there was some really innovative water trading. There's a couple of other things that were done that really reduced the impact significantly. So we can also learn about what are the responses that are effective, too, not just what are the impacts. All right, so we can learn from events as they happen. This is again maybe one that's more speaking to me than to you all, but I don't think it's surprised to know that folks in academia don't always do things that are directly useful. And I think we could all do a better job of it. And I think that the way to do that, right, is to work directly with folks like you on defining what those research priorities should be, right? And so, that there's a lot of groups that are starting to do that more and more effectively, but I think that there's also a lot of ways that there's still a lot to learn. And I think without doing that, I don't think we're going to be answering the right questions. All right, so an example here is so I've been trying to do that in a couple of places. An example is for Pierce County, where we had a series of conversations about climate change impacts and what does that mean and how to plan for it in the floodplain planning group of Plan for the Future group in Pierce County. And what came out of that was we wrote up some sort of summaries of climate change impacts. And we also talked about different additional studies I could do that would sort of help, be a little bit more directly management relevant, right? So we came up with those, we had some criteria for understanding them and prioritize them, and actually are now checking off down the list of a bunch of different studies. So things that, I hadn't really conceived of, we had this one that we called Do Our Plans Measure Up, right? So how much impact are you getting from the projects you're doing? How far is the salt wedge going up the Yellow River? Some examples like that. So very particular to the needs locally. Okay. I'm sorry, there's so many points here. We can come back to any of them, and if they probably could be more distilled, but I only have a few more. So the other thing I think is important to think about is that in some cases the science is more less expensive if it's done regionally than locally, right? So there's economies of scale. Not always, but I think that's something that's worth thinking about. So there's some cases where partnerships are helpful. So one example is there's a lot of hydrologic modeling, so modeling of future stream flow going on around this. Puget Sound specific, sorry, Washington statewide. I'm sure there's similar maps I can make for that. And they're being done by different groups, which isn't bad. I think that's really good in a lot of cases. But there's one potential to coordinate more and maybe get more of an economic scale. And also, you can see from these examples, and this is just quickly what I can remember has been done recently. There's almost all of Puget Sound covered. So there's the potential to sort of have a holistic look at the impacts across Puget Sound using sort of apples to apples comparisons of impacts. That's one example. Another example is, so the flood modeling world has really changed a lot in the last decade. Now it's easier to model flooding across really big scales, which is really helpful for prioritization, right? This is one example from a while back in the Skagit, and it's a map that you can pan and zoom, and you can look at current flooding and using the FEMA model, current future. So this is current flooding, this is mid-century, and this is future. That bend in the middle is the Skagit, is the Mount Vernon, the big hairpin bend near Mount Vernon. The Skagit, if you're familiar. This has been really useful with the community and having conversations about what it means for folks. And it's also just a lot more feasible now than it used to be. All right, so I mentioned prioritization. I think this is a really important one. We often get questions from folks about how to design the project for climate change, and that's really important, and it's a great question. But it's also probably one or two steps down the road from where you want to start asking that question. I think it's more important. You're going to get a lot more bang for your buck out of prioritization than out of redesigning a project. And it's not necessarily because climate change is going to change everything about prioritization, but there are some considerations, right? Like we know where snowpack is changing the most, right? We know there are impacts on sediment dynamics, and so I think it's worth thinking about before you start prioritizing along the projects you're going to do. So an example here is another study from Pierce County. Actually, this is the Do Our Plans Measure Up study I mentioned earlier, and this is just some back of the envelope calculations that looked at how effective if we did all of the levee setbacks, how much would we get out of those? Or if we could do a lot of tributary restoration, how much would we get out of that in terms of flood risk reduction? This is not looking at habitat. This is really just looking at, in this particular case, how much the flood can be reduced. But you could look at other things, right? Okay, this is my last point. We made it. And I think this is a really important one. I think it kind of runs through a lot of what I've already said. People talk about the politicization of science, but in our group, what we were about is the scientization of politics. So I mentioned I've been doing this for 10 or 15 years. I've had the experience on more than one occasion of showing the projections, talking it through with folks that are going to use them, and they're in some cases pretty dramatic, not in every case, right? But in some cases they're pretty dramatic, and then looking at what that means for costs and sort of having a oh my God, kind of moment with folks. And then, at that point, sort of stepping away and then hearing back from folks like 5 or 10 years ago and later to say, hey, we'd like to look at climate change. And they're basically asking that same question again, right? And I think, I'm reading between the lines, but what happens there is that you look at designing for climate change in that instance, and it's super expensive, or it's like politically unpalatable, and so you set it aside, and you work on other things that were more manageable, and then by 5 or 10 years later, you've forgotten that you ever asked the question, and then you come back and you say, hey, I'd like to look at the climate science, see what it means about what I should do, right? And we're just having the same conversation over again, right? And I think that's because there's other problems that are huge, right? That are really hard to contend with. And the only point I'm trying to make here is the science isn't always going to solve those problems, right? I mean, sometimes it's going to be valuable, it's going to be helpful. But I think we have to be clear-eyed about where it's just going to be a hard or popular decision or something like that, right? All right, so that's it. This is my contact information. You're welcome to get in touch. But also we have a ton of time, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, I put out a lot of stuff there, probably way too much, sorry, but I think, you know, I mean, I probably don't have everything right, so I'd like to hear about that too. I mean, I'm happy to clarify anything. I mean, but my big question to you all is like, you know, I mean, we have time here, so like, what would be helpful to talk about, you know, I think, yeah, well, it's gonna be better on, why don't you go ahead?
So we're applying for grants for various projects. We know that there's going to be, one of the priorities listed in all those grants is how is this going to impact climate? It's one of the priorities listed for a lot of grants coming out. So the question is, how can we take our existing or planned projects and incorporate the climate change piece into these new grants that we're going to be applying for, looking at that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're gonna be able to answer that in detail better than me, but I would say, you know, going back to one of the points that you want to not just talk about how you're designing the project so that it can accommodate climate change, that's important, right? But you also want to talk about why you picked that project and why it's a high priority for the project. I think you all are in a good position, right? I mean, the answer for restoration in a lot of cases, I don't want to overgeneralize, but is that it's really good for resilience, right? In a lot of cases, right? You're giving the river more room, you're adding complexity, you know, those things are going to add resilience, right? So that's good. But I think, you know, you can justify why you picked that location and that sort of thing, or what the impacts are, right? Like changing water temperature and fish and that sort of thing. So that's the first part of the answer. I think the second part of the answer is there's some really specific things that I think are going to sort of add credibility to your answer, right? And so those are the things around, you know, uncertainty. So related to adaptive management, right? And so, you know, if you've got a design lifetime probably for your project or some anticipated service life, you know, that tells you how much the climate change is gonna, what climate change impacts to look at, right? Like, are you looking at 2050 or are you looking at 2080, right? And so, like if you're looking at 2050, probably mostly temperature and snowpack that are gonna be different, right? That rainfall thing isn't gonna change till later in the century. And then the other thing that you would be, so that's one example, like time frame, what does that mean? Another concrete thing that I think is really important to include is that piece about sort of the risk management, right? If it is a very adaptable project, one where you're planning on coming in and doing maintenance, able to change your approach over time, then you may not need to design it differently, right? So you can say, we can adapt as conditions change, there's high uncertainty in the projections, so we're gonna do this, and then we'll adjust as follows that if we, right? If on the other hand, you know, you're putting in something that's hard infrastructure of some kind or difficult to adapt, then you want to be specific about, you know, like what would be different or what you're expecting in terms of changes, right? I think the other piece that I don't know as much about, but I think is good to think about is plantings, right? I do think, like, you know, the climate envelope for different species is going to change over time. Again, that's a lifetime question, and also there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? So it could be that the right conclusion is to still plant the same stuff because it's going to live for 30 years and the change isn't that big over that time, right? But it's something to think about, and you could write, you know. So I don't think it's a really high bar to answer those questions with grants. I think it's just making sure that you're addressing some of those key points, right? Like time frame, you know, adaptability, and uncertainty. Yeah. Yeah,
Do you find any techniques that work well to get people that might not be very interested in this kind of stuff or not be people or whatever the case may be overwhelming to them?
Yeah.
And spur them to action. There's a lot of folks we deal with that either just think and lie or that it's digital copies and like that.
yeah, I think that's, actually, should I do repeating questions or parts? Yeah, so, sorry, I didn't repeat the last one, I'll repeat this one, basically how, you know, what's a useful way to engage with folks, either if they're skeptical about climate change or if, you know, or they're just sort of overwhelmed by all the information that's out there. I think that you all may have a better sense of that than me, but I can say that, you know, obviously these things take time, right? So playing the long game in a lot of cases, but there, you know, I think it's helpful to have an illustration. This is where sometimes the data is helpful, or examples, right? Like, so I was talking about looking at current events and putting it in the context of climate change. I found that can be really helpful, so that 2015, right? Or, you know, even just a year to year, like what are the drought conditions this year? Like that's been really helpful. Also because people learn from those conversations, right? So you're kind of capacity building as you go. And then also, you know, folks respond more to, so again, I'm thinking this, you all know, folks respond more to maps, right? Than lots of numbers, right? And so that flood map that I showed a few slides back for the Skagit, I think was really helpful for sort of, I don't want to misrepresent, I think there's still a lot of work to do in the Skagit, but that has been really helpful for advancing conversations there. And actually, for bringing it back to Pierce County, they just did a flood plan, and we've been trying to work with their flood modelers to add in climate change for that same reason, right? Because I think, you know, I think it's just hard to remember what those impacts are unless you see it on page, right? So I think it's being really concrete, it's really helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just curious, you mentioned about the co-development of like research. Kind of framed it as sometimes academia, and always directed for practitioners. And I feel like that's something I've seen, I've been on both sides of that, and I just wondered if you have any guidance for how folks in the room might want to interact with the climate impact group to develop some more of that co-developed research.
Yeah.
And then kind of follow up to that is like, do you have is there a good example you can provide of where that worked really well in terms of matching incentives for folks who are in higher education with folks who do work on that?
Yeah, okay, so the question is just how to make, you know, how to work on with researchers at the university and, you know, what's worked, how to make it work. So what I would say is like, it's not always the right solution. And I think that's important to say. I think, because, you know, there's different incentives, right? Like the folks at the university are sort of, they have this sort of publish prepares thing, right? Like you got to publish articles, you got to do basic research. In a lot of cases, our group's a little different, but in general, that's the case. You know, that's not really advancing what you need on the ground, right? And so, it doesn't always work, right? But I would say, there's a couple of things that I've seen that have worked, and one is, you know, I think it takes time, right? So I think it's just recognizing that it's going to take a little while to be able to speak the same language and understand each other's sort of, you know, where the sort of Venn diagram overlaps, right? I think another one is that this is more on my folks on my side, is that there needs to be from the outset a real emphasis, not just on like doing research, but actually having applications, right? Things that you all need, right? And that's not always been the case. And one of the challenges there that I've seen is that often there's funding for one side and not for the other, right? Like the researchers have funding to do work and they come and talk to folks, but the folks locally don't have any capacity to engage with them, right? And so then it's, you know, you guys are busy, right? There's a lot of other stuff going on, or vice versa, right? On our side, one thing that is helpful is we do have funding from the state that's specifically designed or intended to, you know, support climate adaptation in Washington state communities. Right? And we have a little bit of time set aside basically for answering the phone. And that's going to get us a little bit beyond answering the phone, not a lot, but you know, things like we can point you to stuff, we can have a phone call, you know, we can start to have a conversation. So that's good to know about. I think one thing that we've started to really drill into this, this is something that I think in our world folks had the right philosophy, but maybe in practice had a lot to learn still. So for example, the history of climate adaptation work really has focused on big wealthy cities, right? So like Seattle, Portland, New York City, Miami, and not really been very great at serving like especially rural areas or anybody who's over. And so we started to really wrestle with that in the last couple of years, and we're still learning a lot. So that's why I don't have really good answers. But one of the things that has come up is that this model where one side has funding to have for a partnership and not the other is not workable, somewhat obvious, right? So we haven't figured out exactly how to do that. Is that small grants or like do we like collaborating on proposals is a great option when that's possible, right? So that's still something where we're learning. I think I've been bringing up the Pierce County example a lot because I think it's one example that's worked. And that's because initially we did partner on a proposal and there was a small amount of funding basically for consultation on adaptation. It's often hard, right? For capital funding or it's capital, not planning, right? So that's often hard. This happened to be a grant program, the flip program where you can do both in one. So I would say we're kind of still learning, but those are the kind of the important ingredients. Yeah.
You mentioned throughout your presentation the use of modeling programs for displaying certain scenarios or interaction with the public.
Yeah.
What ones have you kind of found are the most successful?
I'm not sure. Okay, so the question is what kind of modeling programs have we used? What are the most successful? I'm not sure the answer is going to be helpful because it's kind of I think there might be different forms of modeling we're talking about, but we have models that we've used to look at changes in stream flow, right, and changes in climate. And then are you talking more about the one like the visualization programs?
Yeah, like software like Stella
Yeah.
and Star.
Yeah, so we've used a lot of R, Python, we've also used GIS of various forms, and then we've also played around a little bit with Tableau, which is sometimes helpful, not always. But what we found in general, it's definitely the case that when something's more polished, it's more acceptable, right? And that's important. But we found that the platform isn't as important as the process, right? It's not to say like the tool on the out that we get, sorry, I can't speak, isn't important. But it's more what I'm saying is like if if we create a tool in our dialogue to go talk to anybody, it's not going to be that handy, right? But if we're working with someone, it doesn't really matter what the platform is, as long as we're effectively sort of getting each other's ideas about how to make it and what needs to be in there. It's a lot more, it's a lot more used, right? Yeah.
Thanks. I was curious, a lot of the work at TVs and elsewhere is kind of based on the property ownership and kind of bragging with the landscape. A lot of the data that you higher scale.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm curious, both from just like where that kind of breaks down, right? Like at what point is that information not as useful? And and then if you are kind of talking about the watershed scale or whatever, more any thought on getting people together across different parcels to get that more.
Okay, so I feel like you're asking two questions. One is like, what's the basically resolution of the information that we can provide? And is there anything useful to provide at like a personal scale? But also, it seems like you're also asking what's the potential for looking at reach scale planning, sort of property by property. Yeah, and so I think the first one's really important. It's part of the reason that I was talking about all these different ways of getting it impact, right? Because we're never going to get it to the finest scale that want for everything, right? Like, we're not gonna be able to get to an individual, like, suburban lot and what the impact would be there, right? And so there's always gonna have to be some way to sort of crosswalk, in those cases. And, you know, like, for example, I think that the model that I showed with massive for the gadget, I think it's about 100 feet on a side, so it's about 30 meters. Resolution, so you know, it's not bad, but I think even at that scale, there's probably some inaccuracies, right? So you want to kind of smooth it out a little bit. And it's coarser when we're talking about like climate protection, it's not nearly that detailed. So there's always some crosswalk. I mean, it's part of why I think like taking these other perspectives, like current events and that sort of thing is important. So, you know, obviously, like with restoration, you know, it's watershed scale actions that are going to be more valuable from a climate resilience standpoint. And so in that sense, you know, I think collaborating across multiple properties, you know, one of the things I was asking Drew before the session is, you know, to what extent there's sort of potential to work, you know, with other groups, you know, that don't just focus on, but like the private property piece is really important. That's not happening in other contexts, like by the counties often, right? Which is often looking at acquisitions and other kind of work. So I think that there's also that, like understanding the complementarities and taking advantage of those in a larger planning context. Is that getting at what you're asking?
Yeah, I think it is, things that was probably depends, question.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But I think it's, you know, it's really a valuable niche to be working with private property owners, right? Because, you know, in most cases, you're kind of stuck with what exists on private property and that, you know, that's what I see in the stormwater world, right? They're often making, in cities, they're often making infrastructure to compensate for all of the private infrastructure that's lacking, right? So I think it's a really important role, and it's figuring out where to help with that. Yeah, so that's a really good question, like kind of taking a bottom-up perspective, like I think you're asking, where are the, you know, what's the biggest bang for buck in terms of interventions, like where would it be most important to prioritize? That's it. And so like I'm gonna disappoint you here, I don't have an answer to that question, right? Because first of all, it depends on with respect to what, right? Are you asking about salmon and water temperature, right? Or are you talking about salmon and flooding? Or within salmon, there's multiple different dimensions, right? Or are you talking about water quality? And you know, probably it's also probably one of these cases where there's probably some science that's helpful, right? Obviously, and also some that might be like more than you want to take on, right? It could turn into a rabbit hole. So I think there's probably some judgment call to make there. But there are studies that have done this, you know, sort of ask like if I restore this part of the basin, like how much of an effect do I think that's going to happen downstream? And if I restore this part instead, how much, you know, and that's actually, so that's super helpful. And I think in addition to like bang for buck, I think there's also this question of like, will it be enough, right? If we did everything that we want to do, will that actually, you know, solve the problem? And I think that's another important one, right? Like I think from what I hear, and I suspect it's true in this world, you all are talking a lot about, you know, ways to accelerate or expand on the pace of the work, and that's hard for lots of reasons, right? But you know, the whole idea behind there, right, is that it's not enough and you need more, right? So being able to say exactly how far or short it falls would be really valuable. And it's not answering your question, right? It's sort of re-emphasizing that it's important, right? But I think that that's a really important thing to articulate. You know, so I have this example back here. I go back a few if I can. Lost my mouse. Okay, it's not working. So I'll leave it alone. But that example that I had that was looking at the effectiveness of the back of the envelope calculation, effectiveness of if all of the setback levy projects were installed, you know, or if you were able to magically restore the upstream tributaries, what would you get? You know, and I think that that one was really important to look at with the group, because it's what it showed is what it was a reminder that the 100-year flood is going to be terrible no matter what. And so those strategies are going to be really important. They have lots of value, right, for habitat. You know, when you do a setback levy, you're definitely reducing the flood risk locally, right? But they're also not enough, right? And so that was helpful. This is the one I was referencing. So that's an example, right? Where you're trying to say, well, like, what do you get if you do it all? This is quite all, but you know, do a lot. And what do you get out of that, right? And what does that say about what our strategies? So this, to me, suggests that actually, like, stepping back and saying, well, like, yeah, these are really important. We need to do them. It's definitely worthwhile. But also, what else could we be doing? Is kind of the reminder here. And so that's just one example of the slides. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah.
I put it into a question, observation, maybe comment on. I guess we can all assume that in riparian restoration group, there's an inherent good qualities of doing riparian restoration, including resilience to climate change. But then we also know that plant species, fish and wildlife, et cetera, are already adapted. I've read a lot of that. And so when you look at some areas, South Fork of the Nooksack River is the South Fork spring that they're targeting. But I think it was over 10 years ago, a fish biologist, I was at a conference. She finished off her presentation saying basically the South Fork of the Chinook is going to have temperatures equal to Springfield by 2050.
Yeah.
And I asked, well, is that a prediction or is that how? And she said, no, that's the way it's going to be. But yet the focus, and I'm not saying we should still be doing restoration in the South Fork of the Nooksack, but when we're setting us up for failure, we say that it's going to be for the spring Chinook, when we already know fish species are adapting. I just read an article about that. There's hybrid species, there's probably changes in species, there's movement of the zones for plants. It's happened. So, you know, when we apply for grants, I guess, or even just the perspective. So I don't know, I just comment on that.
No, I think that's really important. It's one of the hard things about what you all are doing, right? I mean, it's a good thing too, right? Like you said, the plasticity and that. So, I mean, that's why adaptive management is so important. I mean, I think it is also important this is where it's important to sort of understand what the impacts sort of writ large of doing this work would be, right? Because there's studies in other contexts that have shown that actually you can offset all of the climate change effects on warming with better riparian buffers, places where they've been cleared. I don't know if that's what you would find in the Nooksack, because that wasn't done there. But that'd be an important thing to know, right? So I think it's a good question. And also it gets into the question of triage, which of course is like really sort of dangerous to get into. But you know, I think that's a good question that we need to be thinking about as well. I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question, last comment, but it was about how, you know, if I'm summarizing it well, the book online, you know, we do have species plasticity, we know the ways that species are adapting. And also we have some idea of where they're going to be able to survive and where they're not. And so we put that aside about how to develop it. Yeah.
Have you ever looked into how other, I'll call it Mediterranean climates that are warmer, drier than here, how they deal with, you know, no snowpack? You know, I'm thinking like, you know, Spain, France, there's probably parts of South America that don't have a snow component, well, of course they can, but you know, some of those areas that don't have that snow component, and how those countries have dealt with environments where, let's just say there's no snow, but there's still ag and people and for centuries or more.
Yeah, people live in warmer, drier places than here, and they'd be fine. Yeah, no, so the question was, have we looked at analogs, basically, where the climates are, what we might expect the climate here to look like in the future, to learn, what those habitats often look like, or the adaptations that might be helpful. That basically, yeah. Yeah, and so that's another example of like, instead of looking at the climate projections, find a different way to answer the same question, right? And I think it's really helpful because, again, what you don't get from the climate projections is like, what does it actually look like on the ground when these happen, right? And I actually bring this up a lot in conversations because, one of the questions we get a lot is like, in my world, it's like, are we totally screwed? Or like, is it the end of the world? That kind of thing, right? My point is like, people have cities on on the flanks of volcanoes, right? People live in really inhospitable places to do okay. Habitat a different thing, right? It takes a lot longer, but I think there is a lot of adaptability, right? And so we can learn from those places. And the question is just, I think it's one of the timeline, right? I mean, if we're talking about, a sort of service lifetime or a plan that goes out 30 years, it's very different than if we're talking about one that goes out 70, right? And so if that affects how you want to, where you want to look and what you want to conclude with that, yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting that over time, different decisions are made about rationales for taking certain action, particularly putting in infrastructure, for example. And the basis for making those decisions change over time as things are different.
Yeah.
Right now, we're in a phase in which it seems like removing dams is a big thing, for some very good reasons. But maybe there are some of what you presented, good reasons not to, or to even think about using dams for climate reasons. One, to replace some piece of the lost snowpack, probably can't do all of it, but some of it. And then things like pump storage, where you're able to, use some of the carbon friendly sources of power over time. So do you foresee the flavor of getting rid of dams reversing because of some of the climate mitigation impacts they could bring?
Yeah, so the question was about dams and, the climate change, lots of snowpack is like another reservoir that we're losing, and there's other ways that dams may be useful for, say, recharge or that sort of thing. And so would there be a change in, the need or the desire for dams given climate change there? I think it's a good question, and I think it's not, we don't want that to be a taboo topic, right? And there's examples in the somewhat similar examples, like in the Dungeness River, there's a project where they're installing a side channel reservoir, basically, so not a dam that's blocking the river flow, but that's filled in winter and released in summer, right? For the same reasons that you're describing, for flow augmentation and irrigation. So I think there are things that are looked at. I do think it's important to be careful about this topic, right? So just in the same way that after, as far as I've seen, after every flood, everybody wants more dredging and complains about how that's why we're having flooding and we're not doing dredging anymore. And that's actually not the case. You often also see a lot of clamoring for dams in those moments too, or when there's a particularly dry summer. And it's just one solution, right? In both of those cases, that's the problem. It's one solution that has not been weighed against the others in an objective way, right? So I think that's the thing that I would be careful about, right? And so, for example, the Toledo tribe is doing a lot of research right now on forest management and how that could help retain more snowpack, right? And I think they did at one point have conversations about that as well. So I think it's definitely an important thing to have in the mix and just not being research. Yeah. We have probably more time. I have questions. But I don't know if this is the right forum for it. So yeah, again, this might be like a hard way to have a discussion, but I think that's for me, like the thing that I would like to hear is just, what we heard grant applications are one way that you're sort of being asked to think about climate change. One of my concerns is that in general, like talking about climate change sort of takes away from a lot of the other important work that you all do. So I guess my question is just like, what, you know, what would you like to have? Like, what would be, if you had like a magic wand, like what would be the best way to like, so sort of help you ensure that your work is adapted or considering climate change? What would be the best way to sort of help advance climate change information in your climate? Yeah.
I'd like to say a little bit more, this, you know, I've got more, not just that it's not happening, it's more or less put into. Streams or dumping into the drain streams, cold water refuges, high water refuges, when it comes to the top of, you know, low water issues, water temperature, and things like that, especially just for the sake of keeping, you know, those possible areas for, you know, rents to stay viable, you know, when fish are coming in and spawning, things like that. I didn't see some of that work expand even more because it's being put into, you know, the fish bearing stuff, the regulations of what's actually viable to be done project wise inside of areas. Well, is this a fish bearing stream? You know, I'd like to see it expand more, defining all the kind of varies on what, you know, the limitations are with that, but I'd like to see more of that done for these areas to help try to, well, at least we're trying to do something in a few areas, you know, to provide these areas, you know, these refuge areas.
So it's some more work on the headwater tributaries, and you mean specifically in terms of like how climate change would affect those, or just like emphasizing respiration?
Yeah, and just more restoration and for these areas that have kind of been neglected because they're not looked at as fish bearing, because the fish aren't present in them all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there are some like good climate change reasons to be looking at those, right? Because they're gonna be important for recharge, right? And they're gonna be even not deep groundwater, right? Just for shallow, I mean, soil water retention.
Yeah.
I'd like to echo that, and I just think like I have an urban ecology background, and so when I went to PSU, which is like really focused on a lot of those like urban recharge zones and how impactful those are to like those larger streams. And sometimes that's, I do see that when writing grants or where things are focused, that it's those smaller little areas that do have those like impacts, but
Yeah.
it seems like they're just not valued.
So would it help there to have like, you know, an ability to be able to say, like, if you were to restore those in the way that you're imagining, those headwater streams, like, what would you get? Like, what would be the implication for like,
Yeah.
water management or
Yeah.
groundwater recharge?
Yeah. And like I said, I've seen some of those studies, like when I went to grad school at PSU with some of that and like some really positive impacts of some of those urban streams, but I think continuing that.
Mhm. Great, thanks, that's helpful. Yeah.
I think as a restoration practitioner, it's a difficult thing with climate change that introduces the concept of a fixing baseline to everything you do. And so for any given system, I think it's important to have at my disposal a good idea of where that shifting baseline is based on current science. And that can be difficult, obviously it's difficult to do for a trip, but you know, increasingly everybody's dealing in water jet scale. So knowing where is the system going to be at the end of the life of this particular project I'm putting in, given that, does the project I'm putting in make sense in terms of where that shifting baseline is going to be in terms of plants that are suitable, hydrology, water table, that sort of thing. I think being able to understand that gives us a lot more power to put in effective projects.
Yeah, okay, so I'm repeating things for folks online, but it sounds like sort of maybe more of a breakdown into the way climate change is going to affect specific design considerations. We will talk about this is just you, I'm not going to be able to do them justice, but yeah.
I mean, that's essentially
Yeah, breaking it down into design considerations, okay. Yeah, and you know, those are going to be hard to quantify in some cases. And one thing I didn't mention in my talk is like, I feel like, you know, there's, maybe this isn't how it is, but some of it seems like there's this sense that you gotta go to the science and use the best number, and that's true, right? There's best available science requirements in some cases, but, you know, in other cases, like, just making something up is probably better than not using anything at all, right? Like, so, and sometimes your professional judgment is to do the best thing, right? So, but then that's not to say, that's not something we could do, but I think that's probably gonna be the answer, actually. It's like, well, we've got this information and here's what it says, right? And like about this particular design consideration, we can't really say it, but here are maybe some things to think about, you know? So it ends up being a little general in that way, right? But
Yeah, I mean, you're never gonna be able to pin it down to a number,
Yeah.
right? But at the very least, you know, should I be looking at
right,
different processing plants?
Yeah.
Is this stream I'm working on going to have water?
yeah,
They're getting more and more ephemeral. I'm seeing places in real time.
yeah.
Period of a couple of years. So.
Yeah, and I have a colleague who's focuses on forest management and wildfire, and she's created. And then some of you may know about it, a guidebook for small forest landowners. If you don't know about it, I can pass it along, because it sounds like it'd be pretty relevant here. And it's kind of that question, like, but applied to forest management with landowners. So it's, you know, here's the things to think about, and here's what we, you know, the typical things that folks do, and what kind of plantings might work depending on what you're looking for, what time frame you're looking at. Yeah, so. Got it, thank you. Yeah,
I'm with the deal on the farm side of things. And we're spending a lot of time talking about soil health and doing no-till agriculture and cover crops as a way to
Yeah.
increase soil microbial life. And I can have a whole conversation about all of those things, which all have climate benefits.
sure,
And I can never say the CC words.
yeah,
And so I can have a whole conversation with someone, and someone who may be wherever they're leaning, you know, left, right, or center. I can have a conversation and not bring it up. And if they implement something, it's gonna have this benefit. So thinking about research and things that you're doing, to answer your question, is coming up with those, yeah, this is climate adaptive, this is gonna help. But being able to use your research, share to landowners, managers, because it makes sense for the land, for their operation, for their stream or their forest. And have climate benefit too. So the more you're able to do that, you can take away what someone here said, you know, they shut down as soon as and get defensive. So if you're able to provide strategies to us that are able to introduce those, the benefits or the ancillary benefits that are not necessarily climate change.
yeah, okay, so the comment about meeting people where they're at, and the example for ag, right, it's sometimes the conversation is all about resilience or climate change, but without explicitly mentioning either of those. And that's right, and so resources will sort of help highlight some of those benefits or the implications of those things in management. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, or the other benefits that are there, like adaptability and, you know, wildfire resistance
Right.
or whatever it is.
Yeah,
that we're trying to help us.
Yeah, okay. Good, thanks.
I'm kind of newer, so if I say something dumb, oh, whatever, sorry guys. But one of our big problems is we are in a drier agricultural area. And every time you mention a tree to a farmer, they're like, I don't want trees. Trees take all my water.
Yeah,
And so, you know, echoing what he was saying, yeah, having like, I know my trees are good, but getting that across in a way that, you know, if you had information to help with that process, you know, that's kind of what we're needing is it, like you said, you had, there's these tables and such and maps and we could show them and I don't know where to go and find those things, but yeah.
and do you all think that sort of, you know, because I mean, with those sorts of examples, I think that it's really like, there's local resilience benefits, but there's also sort of aggregated, or what is scale or beyond benefits to those actions, and it's more helpful to emphasize those local resilience benefits, or the, you know, like for instance, is everyone Snohomish, there's a ag group that sort of got together and worked with the county where the competition is to create an ag resilience plan, right? And that would really help. Sort of because it was sort of finding a goal among the ag folks about what their impact was, but also what their responsibility.
Think more local, not, hey, you're not saving the world, but hey, our neighbor.
One thing that I've also found with ag, and you all probably seen this, is, you know, I think that the most important climate change impacts on ag are probably food, water, in most cases, right? Maybe fire, in other cases, things like that. But, you know, there's all this research that's important and useful on like pest, crop, and climate. But my sense so far is that the year-to-year fluctuations in the market and the conditions, weather conditions are far more important than, you know, they're managing for those kinds of things already. And so it's not that constructive to talk about those impacts that are consistent with you all have seen. More useful to talk about, you know, the big ones that are really important, like water. Yeah. Thanks. I have another question, if I can go on. Do we have time? Yeah. So I have also, so this is a not probably helpful distinction outside of the university, but there's two climate groups that do somewhat similar work. One is ours, the climate impact group, and there's others called the State Climate Office. And it's the State Climate Office is a little bit more sort of focused on like if you need climate data, they have access to it. They also support state on like drought declarations. So they do a lot of like current stuff. They track El Nino, that kind of stuff. And we've been thinking that there could be some helpful collaboration between them and the conservation districts and other groups like you all as connect locally, right? So rather than reinventing the wheel and sort of making those connections with property owners and communities, working through you all have a good sense of what would be useful and where the needs are. So I've been wondering like what that could look like, you know, and some thoughts that we had were that, you know, that would it be helpful to have some kind of trainings for conservation district staff on, you know, like I don't know, just it could be any number of things, right? So I'll throw out things, but they're maybe all wrong, right? Like, what are the, you know, good tools for understanding current drought conditions or snowpack conditions, right? Or like, you know, what does El Nino mean for like crops, for example, right? Or you know, or some of these other questions that you are asking. But that's just one idea. It wouldn't have to be training. It would be, there's also this idea of doing research and collaboration. I'm just kind of curious to hear, like, if you were going to start collaborating with the group that's really more focused on like, you know, what are current events in terms of climate, not so much looking forward, but like what do we need to know about what's going on right now? Would there be some useful things that they could bring? Yeah. That was a poorly framed question.
Yeah. Well, I've been outside to help them plan their drought preparedness and mitigation. So it would be helpful to have someone who can come in and collaborate on that and kind of helping them not just with like only their mitigation, but what's their priority, what they need to do for first, and how do they help other people as communities. So it would be helpful to have someone kind of come in and collaborate on that.
Okay, great. Where is that?
That's how.
Okay, yeah.
I like how they bring that drought preparedness mitigation.
Go ahead, back.
Yeah, I just want to say, so I work with the Conservation Commission and I'm in the voluntary stewardship program, so that any county is part of that, it's about 2/3 to 3/4 of the counties in Washington have to report on effectiveness at the watershed scale every 5 years. And some of the things that people are reporting on are like water quantity, aquifer, water quality, or habitat, and all that stuff kind of intersects with fire. You may have less habitat that you're reporting after 5 years, but that's really related to fire, it's not so much related to the ag, affected ag activity or the landscape. So I could see a real need for helping VSP counties just sort of incorporate some of the whatever already exists in terms of planning and prioritization tools into that reporting and provide that context so that folks aren't county's not worried about failing out of the ESP because their reporting looks worse than you would think, but it actually, for the climate safety, are not that.
That kind of brings us to the baseline question that you had
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Because everything in that program is relative to the baseline of 2011. So if you have a snapshot of functions and values of critical areas in 2011, and then every 5 years, we're reporting like how far have we deviated from that? Are we basically the same as that? But that assumes a static baseline, and if climate change changes the ecosystem, then we don't, that 2011 baseline isn't really necessarily going to be the most appropriate way to be looking at it independent of climate change.
So maybe being able to put 2011 into context. In addition to the
Kind of
current.
like accounting for inflation and financial.
Yeah.
I was just thinking like, kind of the small scale of like writing plans and thinking like, I'm probably not gonna be putting this data as much into plans, but it is gonna, like, some sort of training like you're suggesting would help me on my program level of thinking of those questions and how we can start implementing them and that programmatic, like, you know, like how are we gonna go after these programs and where should we prioritize and thinking of those prioritizations versus, you know, finding the project is like what you're saying. And so I think even if sometimes it's not like, oh yeah, I'm gonna take the data from that you present to me and write it in something, I think it's gonna at least give me that mindset of asking those questions in different ways.
Got it. That's really helpful nuance, right? Like, that's not really so much training as like consultation or, yeah, like, almost like the asking the business management question. Yeah. Great, thanks. Yeah,
I feel like that sort of related to that would be something that could be potentially useful is like more localized sort of work groups where practitioners in certain regions about, you know, what their priorities are, where they feel that their lack of understanding is, you know, with somebody who is more in academia and just having, you know, semi-regular meetings where people can, you know, bounce ideas off of each other, say, hey, we would actually like a training in this, and like that would be a good way to gauge needs in different areas of the state, potentially.
yeah. So, like sort of both bringing together on the practice side, folks who have similar interests.
Yeah.
Maybe with some help from us, but like mostly just really exchange ideas.
With, you know, some people who have some of the more academic knowledge, you know, to be able to help fill in the gaps. Yeah.
Also kind of going on that, it might be helpful for like grant writing as well. Because a lot of our grants are asking for future sustainability impacts and like how we can preserve for future generations. I mean, we have like that things knowledge, right? But like having your verbiage.
That's something we heard before. Thanks. We're coming at the end. I don't want to cut into your lunch hour, but I appreciate y'all letting me pick your brains. You were here in the media and I made you talk.